So, today I will discuss Ukrainian situation and the topic of the talk is why should we support Ukraine. As usual, you can just anytime write comments and questions to the chat and I will answer them after the broadcast. In case someone is joining us late, the talk will be published in my podcast and in YouTube channel, and also in 1 or 2 days I hope my blog version of this text will be ready. But so, the topic today is to Ukraine, and this text was originally written in Russian, but I also passed this to some people who don't so much speak Russian, because nowadays the automatic translation is pretty well, and there was lots of also misunderstandings and also some criticism. This was criticized my column in Autonom website was also, there was a commentary, like kind of criticism also in the Crime Think website, which attempts to gather materials of the Ukrainian situation. So the English version I added a bit additional commentary and discussion with possible opposing arguments of my argumentation. So my argument goes, why should we support Ukraine? I still don't believe that there will be a major war. There might be some sort of border escalation, for example. Why the war doesn't seem to be so unlikely, I discussed in another Russian column in the Autonom website. Basically the reason is I don't see that the cost and benefit ratio would be good enough for Putin for this. But also today there was another new step. This Donetsk People's Republic, they announced that they would evacuate the civilian population. Of course this could all be part of the same bluff game, but maybe not necessary. It also might be a sign of some dangerous times to come, but we will see. There has been many people have been, there was already kind of expected that war will start in the 16th. Also next possible dates that have been discussed is the last day of the Olympics or Monday after Olympic Games or so on. So we will see what happens with that, but as far I would put my bets that there will not be like at least no major invasion to Ukraine. But in this talk I will discuss in case a major invasion happen, because it cannot be excluded. We cannot know what Putin is thinking, what's going on inside his head, and also even if no one is really hoping for the war, always in this kind of crisis situation it's possible that the war starts by just small steps of escalation, even if no one really wants the war. And also, I don't think that Ukraine is highly successful parliamentarian system. The first 30 years there have been more or less a failure. It's one of the worst economic growths in the world. The media are mostly handled by different rival oligarchy groups. There is staggering level of corruption, and economic development is currently actually even behind many countries of sub-Saharan Africa. And also Ukraine has become a center of the neo-Nazi movement, although I must say that this neo-Nazi aspect is somehow often exaggerated, because even though neo-Nazis are many in Ukraine, they are important in certain areas like security business. They still are quite unpopular in the general elections. Neo-Nazis are not in any means in power in Ukraine, or they are not about to get power in any time soon, but it's still an important center of the worldwide neo-Nazi organizing. But still, when we discuss full-scale wars and occupations and invasions, the alternative would be even worse. Like, Putin is not only gendarme of Europe, like was Nikolai I, similar character in Russian history, but is gendarme of the whole world and is going to places like Syria and Myanmar just to find some allies as the worst kind of dictatorships. Like whoever wants to become a dictator and starts to torture and murder their own citizens, they always can count on some commercial and security relations with Putin and with Russia. In Russia there is no anymore any elections at all, and any kinds of even most modest attempts to change something in Russia is huge repression. Like one by one, all the different oppositional movements, even the most moderate, are being repressed. What's going on at the moment is attempts to destroy the feminist movement. It's latest in a long chain. First National Bolsheviks, then or maybe even like radical Leninists already in the 90s, then the National Bolsheviks, Nazis, Islamists, then Navalny movement, and now it's the turn of the feminists to be repressed. And so, in case of this war, which I still consider unlikely, but possible, I think we should be in side of Ukraine. We should be supporting Ukraine defense on itself. There is no any aggression from Ukraine towards Russia. Currently, the Ukrainian interest is just to preserve their own country, like the Ukrainian government interest is just to support to preserve their own area. Obviously, yeah, there are ceasefire violation in Donbass. Both sides are involved in this. It's pretty much impossible to define who is shooting, but while I was there in 2017, I saw both. I was in Ukrainian side, in Avdiivka, and some other places. I both saw shells coming and shells going. So my impression is that both sides are shooting. Why the both sides are shooting? Because there is no peace. There is no peace treaty that would be supported by both sides of the conflict. So the small scale war has been going on for the last 7 years, but still no full-scale escalation until perhaps now, after the spring of 2015. And so I can quote Malatesta. Malatesta said that for me there is no doubt that the worst democracies are always preferable, if only from the educational point of view, than the best of dictatorships. And actually Bakunin also has a similar, almost the same quote, more earlier, that is somehow less, he's less quoted in the West Europe than Malatesta apparently. And in the North America, in the Western world, this is perhaps because mostly anti-authoritarians during the last decades have been criticizing parliamentarian system and so-called democracies. So there has not been so much a situation of choice between democracy and dictatorship as far as the Western Europe and North America go. But yeah, there has been, I've seen declaration, some leftist groups declaration, both Russian and abroad, that they are against any kind of imperialism in Ukraine. But I cannot take this declaration very seriously. Obviously, like there is American imperialism, it was behind the Iraqi war, for example. It's also obvious in Central America. But I don't think there is any American imperialism in Ukraine. Like NATO and USA, they have given, basically, they have given up on Ukraine. Ukraine has been given to to Russian sphere of influence. Yeah, Ukraine is getting some economic aid, it's getting military aid, but this is obviously not enough to stop any possible Russian attack. And also there are no any Western countries willing to send troops to Ukraine in case of an invasion. If there will be a war, Ukraine will face the invasion alone. Besides some, and also there are promises of economic sanctions, but no sanctions have stopped Russia this far. Like this kind of things, the sanctions won't solve. So there is no wars that have been won with economic sanctions. They are more like just a measure to show that some reaction has been done. But basically, economic sanctions, it's a means of those who don't want to really solve the problems. So anyway, let's go to this slogan, no war about the class war, and what, in my opinion, it does mean historically. And there is discussion in the anarchist circles about possible traps of choosing the less of the two evils. Obviously, this is often not necessary or not even possible, but still there are lots of historical cases when such choices have been made, and actually these choices have made sense. For example, most of the participators of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, they were Zionists, but there were also some internationalists involved from the Socialist Bund organization, which was anti-Zionist socialist Jewish organization. And I have never read that some anarchist or internationalist of these times that they would say that, oh, we are against both German nationalism and imperialism. We are against the German nationalism and imperialism of the Nazis, but also against the Jewish nationalism of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And also during the Algerian War, the French army was murdering thousands of Algerians. There was, or even tens of thousands. There were arbitrary arrests and executions, napalm bombing. But the French anarcho-syndicalists, anarcho-communists, didn't declare that they are against French and Algerian nationalism. Instead of this, the French anarcho-communists, they provide concrete support to the Algerian rebel cause. And as a consequence, actually, the French communist movement was seriously repressed. There were courts, prison sentences, and for many years the movement was completely crushed. So they really make this dangerous choice, and they were the consequences of this support of the Algerian rebellion cause, but and they paid a price also for this. But they ended up being in the right side of the history. And when Israel is stealing the Palestinian fields and making evictions, the anarchists are not saying that, oh, we are against Israeli nationalism and the Palestinian nationalism, but they are supporting the farmers who are being evicted from their land. Together with Palestinians, even if there might be some differences of ideology and position. So what would happen if Russia would occupy Ukraine? The result would be a collaborationist regime. There would be massive repressions. There wouldn't be any civil liberties anymore in Ukraine. So, in my opinion, the slogan "No war about the class war," it doesn't mean that we should just maintain neutrality in case of occupation. And it means that anarchists should be opposed to aggressive wars. And this resistance against Russian aggression is not only in the interest of the working class of Ukraine, but also in the interest of the working class in Russia. Actually, this kind of resistance might be the only way to get rid of Putin before he just dies in the old age. And yes, as for the Nazis in Ukraine, they don't have such core ideas. Probably some of them would be cooperating with the occupational regime, and they would be part of the possible Kremlin government that would been set up in occupied Ukraine. Obviously, I think that anarchists should, in any situation, trying to be maximally autonomous from any kind of army structures, but also I don't think that some unit of 50 anarchists armed with slingshots and firecrackers would be any serious threat to the invasion. Instead, the stable Ukrainian army is quite a serious threat. It's not the same army as the 2014 in the time of the Kremlin invasion. It's actually quite a serious force. It's 200,000 people are constantly serving in the army, and together with the reserves, it's 900,000. I don't think there is really any chances that the Russian invasion will be a very simple and easy thing. And yes, it's true that the Ukrainian army won't be able to defeat the Russian invasion. It might be able to resist some weeks or months, but still it would cause some serious cost to the invasional force. And the support of the army, Ukrainian army, in case of invasion, it obviously shouldn't mean that anarchists don't have any right to criticize the army decisions or the government or try to make their own autonomous decision, but still I think that the army probably has the best capacity to do something against a possible invasion. So what happens after the first phase of the invasion with when Ukraine is occupied? There will be obviously would be a resistance movement. There might be a several autonomous resistance group or one very strong kind of underground government, as there was in Poland. During the Nazi occupation, there was the Polish Home Army, which was basically underground Polish government. And there is also maybe possible that there will be civil resistance, like strikes and other forms of direct actions. But we already saw in the examples of this so-called People's Republics, Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic, that all the kinds of civil society was like totally repressed there. All the kinds of non-violent resistance were very heavily punished. People who participated in non-violent resistance were arrested and put to basements and tortured for months and often just murdered. So it's quite likely that there is no any other means to oppose the Russian occupation except the armed struggle. And in case there would be some unitary strong resistance organization, I think it makes sense for anarchists to support it. And this is, for example, what the Polish syndicalists of the ZSP organization did during the Polish Nazi occupation and also during the Warsaw Uprising. And yeah. And most of the anarchists actually during the Second World War, they were cooperating with different mainstream resistance movements. Even if the mainstream resistance movement were always controlled by either some bourgeois nationalist or Stalinist. For example, in France, the refugees from the Spanish CNT, the syndicalist refugees, they joined the army of the Free France, which was led by the General de Gaulle. And actually, the consequences of this alliance was that anarchists actually liberated Paris from the Nazi occupation, but this was maybe not so much due the anarchists being the best fighters, but just because the Allied command was so racist that they wanted that if de Gaulle and the Free French army would liberate Paris, it should be at least white soldiers, because majority of the forces of the Free France were black soldiers from the French African colonies, and only units which were basically mostly white, they were consisting of mostly of the Spanish syndicalists. So this is like historic curiosity, but it's good to remember that this was not kind of consequences of anarchist heroism, but more like prejudices of the Allied army. In Russia, obviously, anarchists pretty much have that there is lots of cult building and mythology around Victory Day and the Second World War. Anarchists often have to criticize this. In general, the Victory Day is just a huge militaristic parading of the current regime. And it's also, in some particular cases, you can actually say that Stalin was not much better than Hitler. For example, Stalin was also did genocides against complete groups of people, like in Chechnya. But in general, I think also if you read about history of the Second World War, if you really study what were the Hitler's plans, it's obvious that there was like bigger evil and the lesser evil, and the lesser evil actually win the war. And this was also position of most of the anarchists inside the occupied Europe. Anarchists were mostly, and other anti-authoritarian groups, they were mostly cooperating with the Allies. I only know about one exception. It's connected to the Dutch Council Communist movement. There was a group called Marx-Lenin-Luxemburg Front. They started with the Trotskyists, but during the war they drifted towards Council Communist position. There were some dozens or few hundred people involved in the underground organization, but they had a very principled, hardcore position against both Allies and the Nazis. They were also, for example, calling not to defend the Soviet Union, because Soviet Union was just another form of capitalism, according to their analysis. Of course, no one in the Soviet Union knew what they wrote in Netherlands in the leaflets in Dutch, but still they had this kind of position. Well, but eventually, already in the 1942, the Nazis caught almost all of the leaders of the organization, and they were shot. And this very principled position didn't really make much difference in that case, except of course that people who nowadays are drawing from the Council Communism or more general ultra-left tradition, they can say that okay, there was this kind of very principled group. Anarchists were doing slightly better. Besides this example of liberating Paris, anarchist partisans were liberating city of Carrara in Italy from the fascists, and eventually Carrara became a very strong center of anarchist movement for a very long time. But it's also true that the anarchist movement never, after the Second World War, grew as strong as it was before the World War. But I don't think that this was because anarchists were joining with allies in a common big anti-fascist front. I think there are other reasons for this, which I maybe discussed in some other time. Okay, I have to check how is the recording. Seems to be doing good. So, yeah, so back to the topic of revolutionary ethics from where I started, and which was actually the discussion that resulted from our original text. I was discussing in the Autonom website with some people who share position more inspired from council communist or ultra-leftist thinking. And I think we should look a bit more into kind of meta-ethics to see where these differences come between the different traditions of thinking. And kind of like ethics we were discussing in the high school philosophy classes or also in the university, it often goes around issues like utilitarian ethic or categoric imperative. But this is more like very individualistic point of view, like what should some person do to guarantee the biggest happiness for himself or his group or what family or whatever. But obviously, like when we discuss some revolutionary movement, there should also be perspective of benefit of the working class as a whole, and also revolutionary organizing. Because from a simple utilitarian perspective, obviously the result of the Dutch MLL group's resistance or French anarcho-communist of the 50s, it was a failure. Like these people, like Dutch council communists, they got executed, the French anarcho-communists got jailed and their movement was destroyed. So none of them, this struggle was a failure. From utilitarian point of view, it was pointless. And also wouldn't see any point to make this some Kantian categoric imperative either. But we should also see like more wider perspective in different revolutionary movements. It's like this kind of defeat. It's just how to say. Defeats are result of most of the struggles. Most of the struggles end up to defeats, but it's not necessarily a tragedy because a defeat can open paths to new struggles. And more important, like I already said in more early part of the discussion, that we should be in the right side of the history. Even if French communists, they got their groups and movement at least destroyed, at least temporary, they contributed to destruction of the colonialism. However, where MLL front, I wouldn't say that they were in the right side of the history because they rejected the anti-fascist struggle. But also, to defend the MML front and the Dutch council communists of the 40s, I should say that they probably didn't have the full picture about the Holocaust and Nazi regime horrors. But this is not the same. It's not the same with the modern day ultra leftists and the neo-council communists, and also with anarchists who are drawing from ultra leftist analysis. I think council communist theory, it was pretty much accurate in the condition of the 30s and the experiences of the 30s, but it has never been updated according to the Second World War and the Holocaust. And also it never drew anything from the experiences of the anti-fascist resistance, which council communism and the neo-council communism and ultra-leftism generally reject. Ultra-leftist theory is pretty consistent on the idea that they are against revolutionary organizing, obviously. Ultra-leftists accept like spontaneous rebellions and strikes and also propaganda groups, distribution of revolutionary propaganda. But ultra-leftists, they also reject kind of long-term organization and all the kind of, how to say, activist approaches to things. According to ultra-leftists, there is no such a thing as revolutionary organizing, but only working class that is organizing when the time is right. So, in the ultra-left theory, basically, there is no any clear link between doing revolutionary work and revolution. You cannot really really spark the revolution by some sort of activism. And consequence of this is that because the revolutionary organizing is not really necessary, you also don't really need any civil rights. That makes revolutionary organizing possible, or not even human rights. So, for ultra-leftists, the only relevant human right is the right to communism. So, parliamentarism and military occupation is basically the same thing. And also, if we go back to Ukraine and discussion about Ukraine, these separatist People's Republics of the East Ukraine and Ukrainian government, they are just as far from the communism so basically, yeah, this kind of occupation and bourgeois government, they are just as bad. And this is why it's completely consistent with ultra-leftism to call that Ukrainian soldiers should desert in case of an invasion, just like ultra-leftists would, for example, call that fighters of the Popular Front in Spain should desert, and also that Warsaw ghetto uprising should maybe not cooperate with Zionism and so on. Ultra-left, they don't really care about anarchists and other activists being kidnapped and tortured and murdered by separatists or Russian army or Russian secret services, because activism in general is useless according to ultra-leftist analysis. And why do I discuss with small Dutch group or ultra-left? Because actually lately, during the last 50 years, these ultra-leftist concepts have become quite popular in the anarchist movement. This discussion with the council communism, it came through the Socialism and Barbary of Cornelius Castoriadis and Situationist International. It basically started to these ideas and concepts started to spread with the anarchist movement, and you cannot really so much separate, even nowadays, the ultra-leftist Marxist tradition and anarchist tradition, especially after the Greek uprising of 2008. His ideas have become pretty much mainstream in the anarchist and hegemonic in the anarchist movement. But in contrary to ultra-leftist and anti-organizational anarchists, I think support of anarchist activism and organizing they just cannot accept this perspective of completely destruction of our own movement, both materially and physically. Like, we cannot be indifferent towards our own perspective of dying in some basement tortured by Russian army. So, but also, I don't think that anarchists should have much illusions of victory of the resistance. Even if there was a full-scale war and successful resistance movement that would basically beat back the Russian occupation and maybe even destroy the current Russian regime, it wouldn't mean any bigger perspective for revolutionary struggle than was in Ukraine, let us say, before 2014, or in Russia in time of the Soviet Union collapse in 1991. But anyway, this is all just some discussion of historical curiosities, and still I have discussed a lot of the occupation. Okay. So, yeah, I was just reading some discussion in the chat. So, yeah, back for the present day, current Russian occupation of Ukraine is unlikely. In general, it's impossible to choose correct positions in this all possible future scenarios. But the goal of resistance against a possible possible invasion. It would be basically make Ukraine ungovernable to the occupation, and makes such big economic and human costs for the invasion force that it will also bring back the whole Putin's regime. And this was not possible in Chechnya or Syria or Georgia, but Ukraine has a completely another scale of possibilities of resistance than, for example, Syria is having. And also I think there are some demands that we should be raising here and now. For example, currently Germany and also possibly Finland are preventing Ukraine of getting arms. For example, Estonia has been attempting to sell some old artillery pieces to Ukraine, but this needs acceptance of both Germany and Finland because this has been in service in Germany and Finland. And I don't think that military means or increasing military capacity is basically means to solve conflicts that are in Ukraine. There are also plenty of domestic reasons for the conflict in Ukraine. But also, if Ukraine doesn't have any proper army, Russia doesn't have any reasons even to negotiate with Ukraine. And also, I think anti-authoritarians in Russia, they should be fighting against this aggressive posturing from the Kremlin. And in the EU area, we should at least stop attempts to sabotage Ukrainian self-defense. But anyway, this was all of my points today. If you have some comments or questions for the chat, feel free to ask them. But as for the recording, I think this is enough by now. I might be doing another broadcast in English in week or two. I have an old text which I wrote for the Brand Journal in English some years ago, which I never published online, and I also might make a stream to discuss the topics. This goes more to the background of the conflicts and trying to dig the reality behind the propaganda of the both parts, especially for the period of Maidan and immediately afterwards, the first years of the war, and the first years of the conflict in Donbass. Because the text is in English, it would make sense also to make the stream in English. But as for today, I think this is enough. It took even maybe a bit too long. I hope my talk somehow made a sense. In case no, you can check in a couple of days if the written version made any much more sense. But thanks for now. Hope to see all of you the next time.